I was elbow-deep in compost when I heard it. A high-pitched scream tore through the morning air, followed by a metallic zip and then a colossal splash. I looked up just in time to see a woman in a white wedding dress hurtling through the sky above my tomato field, gripping a zipline handle with one hand and a bouquet in the other. She flew like a shrieking angel of chaos before crashing into a kiddie pool I had deliberately placed at the landing zone. Water exploded upward like a geyser, soaking the guests below and sending her wig flying into my sunflowers. The crowd gasped. A few phones dropped. One child cried. And me? I just sipped my coffee and said the words I'd waited weeks to say. Told you not to zipline over my land. My name's Vince. I'm not the revenge type by nature. I live on 10 acres of quiet countryside that my family has owned since the 1950s. I raise chickens, grow heirloom tomatoes, and take pride in staying out of people's business. My land is my peace. That was until the new HOA president moved in next door. Karen. And if you're imagining a sun hat-wearing, clipboard-hugging suburban menace with a voice that could peel paint off a barn, congratulations. You've already met her in your mind. She moved in 6 months ago and treated our rural community like it was her personal resort. It started with her putting tiki torches on the sidewalk. Then she tried installing speed bumps on a private dirt road. And then, God help me, she built a 2-story gazebo that blasted smooth jazz at 7 a.m. But the real chaos started when Karen decided to build a zipline. Not just any zipline. A full-length, steel-cabled monstrosity that stretched from her second-story balcony, over the fence line, across my tomato field, and ended at a splash pad near her back porch. I noticed the first anchor bolt in one of my oak trees. I thought maybe it was a prank. Surely, no sane adult would install a recreational ride over someone else's property without asking. Right? Wrong. The next morning, I heard screaming and whizzing sounds. Turns out it was her nephews taking turns ziplining with GoPros on their heads. I walked straight over to her porch to confront her. She answered the door with glitter on her cheek and a mimosa in hand. I politely informed her that the zipline was trespassing and needed to come down. She didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head and said, "Oh, Vince, don't be so territorial. It's just airspace. Besides, everyone loves it. The community's obsessed." I told her I didn't care if NASA was obsessed. That oak tree was mine, and so was the air above my tomatoes. She rolled her eyes, muttered something about old men and boundaries, and closed the door in my face. The days that followed turned my farm into a nightmare. I was hit in the head by a falling flip-flop. One zipliner threw up mid-flight and spattered my chicken coop. A poor kid got stuck halfway across and dangled above my scarecrow for 2 hours before Karen's cousin used a pool net to pull him down. I tried reasoning again, but she'd always have the same smirk, saying things like it's not that deep or you should be grateful. Your crops are in the background of every video. She was monetizing my land without permission, getting millions of views on her HOA YouTube series titled Sky Karen. Every click had my tomatoes and trellises in the background, no credit, no permission, and definitely no compensation. Then she hosted her so-called trial wedding, a rehearsal for a bigger public ceremony. It was part of her online content. She zipped across my land in a wedding gown while tossing rose petals midair, and then landed in a kiddie pool filled with pink glitter water. She splashed half of it on my compost pile, which began to stink like perfume and rotting fruit. That was the last straw. I called the HOA and filed an official complaint. Their response? Since the zipline starts on her property and ends on her property, they said it wasn't under their jurisdiction. I brought out a property survey. They waved it off. That's when I found out Karen was dating the zoning chair. Fed up, I put up no trespassing signs and posted warnings. I installed a trail cam and even put up a makeshift scarecrow in the path, hoping to make the ride look less inviting. Instead, Karen made a video mocking me, dressing the scarecrow in a bridal gown and calling it my future wife. The views exploded. I got mocked in the comments by people with usernames like HOA Queen 87 and Karen Nation. My blood boiled. And to make matters worse, one zipliner crash-landed into my greenhouse, snapping 4 irrigation pipes and smashing 3 tomato planters. I presented Karen with a bill. She handed it back with lipstick on it and wrote, LOL. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was legal. I reached out to a real surveyor and paid for a full mapping of the property lines. It confirmed, in no uncertain terms, that the zip line crossed 22 feet over my boundary and that the anchor was illegally bolted into my tree. I sent her a cease and desist letter. She framed it and hung it on her patio. That's when I started planning my response. Not one out of anger, but out of principle. A way to ensure that no one ever tried to fly over my land again without consequences. I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted to make it so unforgettable that no one would dare try it again. So I waited. I let her plan her big sky wedding. I let her invite the HOA board, the videographers, the DJ with the drone. I let her think she was winning. And while she rehearsed her mid-air bouquet tosses, I was busy setting up a kiddie pool lined with biodegradable green dye and surrounded by silent sprinklers on motion sensors. And I rigged the anchor with a timed release mechanism I designed myself. It wouldn't snap violently. It would gently unhook after a certain amount of stress, exactly halfway through her zip. It was safe, just not dignified. So when the day came, and she zipped through the air with her usual shrill laugh and outstretched arms, I stood calmly in the field below, pretending to water my cucumbers. Right as she reached the halfway point, the line unlatched and the tension snapped. Karen dropped like a stunned parrot and flopped into the green water with a shriek that echoed across 3 properties. The guests gasped. The DJ stopped the music. The drone caught it all. I didn't even flinch. I just tipped my straw hat, looked at the cameras, and smiled. Because when someone builds a circus over your land, sometimes the only way to take it down is to let the ringleader fly. The aftermath of Karen's unceremonious dive into the kiddie pool was, to put it mildly, explosive. While she coughed up water and glitter, her guests scrambled in confusion. A few tried to help her out, but most were too busy capturing the moment on their phones. Within an hour, the incident was already clipped, edited, and spreading online. The video was titled something like, Karen Gets Baptized by Consequences, and the comments were ruthless. But if you think that was the end of it, you don't know Karen. She wasn't the type to take embarrassment as a cue to stop. No, to her, it was simply an invitation to escalate. That evening, while I enjoyed the peace and quiet finally restored to my land, I received a knock at the door. Standing there was none other than Greg, a lanky man in a sweat-soaked HOA polo shirt and holding a clipboard that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2003. He cleared his throat dramatically, clearly uncomfortable. According to Karen's official complaint, I had created a deliberate hazard leading to public humiliation and emotional distress. She claimed I sabotaged the zipline with malicious intent and endangered her guests. Greg looked at me like he didn't want to be there. I asked him if he saw the video. He had. I asked him if he noticed how the kiddie pool cushioned her fall and no one was hurt. He had. But Karen had insisted the HOA follow up. And when Karen insists, people either cave or get voted out. So I handed Greg a copy of the property line survey, which clearly showed the zipline's illegal encroachment. He glanced over it like it was written in Latin, then mumbled something about needing to run this up the chain. I knew exactly which chain he meant, Karen's boyfriend, Darren, who sat on the HOA zoning committee. Darren was one of those guys who thought being in a small position of power made him untouchable. He drove a golf cart like it was a patrol vehicle, wore mirrored sunglasses indoors, and referred to himself as Deputy Chair, as if he were second in command to the President of the United States. I had a run-in with him once before when he tried to fine me for having a rooster that crowed too early. It was 6:01 a.m. The rule book said nothing before 6 a.m. He walked away defeated but with a grudge in his eyes. 2 days later, a new sign appeared on my fence. HOA border zone, no unauthorized activity. It was laminated, zip-tied to the wooden post, and placed right next to one of my sunflowers. I removed it. The next day, 2 signs. I removed them again. Then came a letter. Not from the HOA this time, but from a third-party legal service claiming I was under investigation for operating an unlicensed recreational hazard. The irony nearly made me laugh. Karen had launched a formal case claiming that my actions were threatening the neighborhood's safety. It was the equivalent of a thief suing a homeowner for tripping on the way out. I decided to stop playing defense. I filed my own complaint with the county office and included photographic evidence, the survey documents, and a detailed account of every infraction. I listed every damage to my property, from the smashed greenhouse window to the lost heirloom crop from the mudsplash disaster. I even included screenshots of Karen's online videos where she bragged about borrowing a bit of Vince's airspace. The woman wasn't just entitled, she was practically begging for legal consequences. While waiting for the county's reply, I turned to the one place Karen never expected resistance from, the other neighbors. Most had been quiet, too afraid or too disinterested to challenge her authority. But now that the viral video had given her a black eye in the court of public opinion, the tide was shifting. I started getting visits. Jorge, a soft-spoken veteran who lived on the edge of the HOA property, brought over a thermos of black coffee and muttered, "She ran a zipline across my roof last year. Never asked." Then came Linda, a retired school principal who'd been fined 3 times for growing wildflowers in her yard. She handed me a printed list of HOA violations Karen had committed herself, complete with photos and date. With a coalition forming, I invited a few of them over one evening and laid out a plan. We weren't going to fight dirty, we were going to fight smart. Jorge contacted a friend who worked at the zoning office downtown and confirmed what I already suspected. The zipline permit Karen submitted was not only expired, but it was filed under a completely different property address. Linda drafted a letter requesting a formal audit of HOA procedures, citing multiple conflict of interest concerns involving Karen and Darren. And I bought a new drone. My old one had done a good job capturing the antics, but I needed clearer footage. The new drone had a 4K camera and thermal tracking, which was overkill, but the idea of documenting every single zipline violation with clarity made it worth the money. Within 3 days, I had footage of late-night rides, kids trespassing for selfies, and even a moment when Darren tried reattaching the zipline's anchor in the middle of the night with a wrench and a flashlight. That footage alone was enough to raise eyebrows at the county office. But I held on to it, waiting for just the right moment. Karen, oblivious to the quiet war building around her, continued planning her next event, Sky Yoga Saturdays. She posted flyers all over the community center, offering mindful gliding meditations while suspended midair. That was the breaking point for many residents. Even those who had been neutral began to realize she was turning their neighborhood into a circus without rules. Complaints started pouring in, noise complaints, safety concerns, even one about Karen letting her dog poop in neighbors' yards and filming it for comedic contrast. When the county inspector finally showed up, he was met with a mixed bag of hospitality. Karen greeted him with a tray of lemon bars and a tone so sugary it could rot teeth. Meanwhile, I met him with the full binder of documents, time-stamped footage, signed statements, and a short but firm statement. "This isn't about drama," I said. "This is about land, safety, and abuse of power." He nodded, already familiar with the situation thanks to Jorge's friend in zoning. After an hour-long walkthrough, he handed Karen a citation for operating an unpermitted recreational structure on private land. That moment was sweet, but it wasn't the end. Karen still had cards to play. She filed a restraining order against me, citing ongoing harassment. I found out when a deputy showed up to inform me I was to stay 50 feet away from her house. I laughed and pointed out that my land starts at 48. The deputy cracked a smile and said, "Just don't build a revenge zipline and we're good." As the restraining order hung in the air like a bad smell, Karen doubled down. She hosted a live stream where she claimed she was being victimized by a rogue farmer, said I was threatening her lifestyle, and even went as far as to suggest that I was polluting the neighborhood with unregulated agriculture. The video didn't go the way she hoped. Comments flooded in, mocking her for using a pool as a landing pad and calling her out for exploiting her neighbors. Sky Karen trended again, this time not as a star, but as a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, the audit Linda requested was approved. The HOA board would be under investigation. Darren started sweating. His demeanor changed at meetings. He stopped wearing his mirrored sunglasses. And Karen? She went quiet. Not for long, though. Because just when I thought things couldn't get more absurd, I got word from a neighbor that she was planning one final stunt. Something theatrical. Something big. And if I knew her at all, it would involve my land again. I wasn't just going to be ready. I was going to be 3 steps ahead. The rumors started small, like whispers carried on the wind. One neighbor said Karen was planning a charity event. Another claimed she was hosting a fundraiser for HOA beautification, whatever that meant. But the most persistent buzz came from the teenagers in the neighborhood who had somehow overheard their parents talking. Apparently, Karen was organizing a grand finale for her content series. A sky wedding encore, complete with drones, a mini orchestra, confetti cannons, and of course, another zipline run. But this time, it would be bigger, higher, and more meaningful, as she reportedly told someone at the dog park while wearing a sash that said bride again. I didn't need to hear much more to know exactly what she was up to. Karen wasn't just returning to the zipline. She was planning a full-blown spectacle, something designed to humiliate me publicly or at least show the world that she wasn't cowed by the green-dyed kiddie pool incident. And while I didn't care much about the public's opinion, I did care about my land. I cared that she was now doubling down on trespassing as performance art. I cared that she was dragging other people into it, musicians, photographers, influencers, a guest list of 50 or more. It was no longer just her flying over my field. It was a parade in the sky with my soil as the red carpet. I spent the next few days watching her backyard from a distance, using binoculars like a bored park ranger. Sure enough, she and Darren were out there constantly, measuring distances, laying down new rigging lines, shouting at delivery drivers. She even had a small crane brought in to help reinforce the balcony where the zipline started. I could hear her barking instructions like a tyrant general planning an aerial invasion. It was bizarre, surreal even. She was turning her backyard into a movie set, and she didn't seem to care about legality, common sense, or how many HOA rules she'd already stomped on. What she didn't know was that I had a new ally. One of the temporary workers she'd hired to help with the event had reached out to me. A guy named Kyle, maybe 20 years old, lanky, with an eye twitch and a nervous laugh. He showed up at my porch with a hoodie pulled low and whispered like he was leaking government secrets. He told me Karen had asked him to install a temporary support rig on my tree again, the very same oak she'd already damaged once before. When he told her it might be trespassing, she said, "Don't worry, it's just Vince. He'll complain, then disappear like he always does." Kyle didn't like that. He said he came from a family of farmers and didn't sit well with people disrespecting the land. He handed me a flash drive with videos he'd taken on his phone. Most were mundane, Karen yelling at people, Darren pretending to be a structural engineer, but one clip stood out. It showed Karen explicitly instructing the team to dig small holes in my soil for stabilizers to keep the new cable taut. That wasn't just trespassing. That was damage. That was theft of use. I thanked Kyle and offered him some eggs from my hens, which he accepted like gold bars. Then I got to work. I wasn't going to sabotage the rig this time. That ship had sailed, and Karen had already turned the first incident into sympathy points with her little online fan club. No, this time I would stay completely within the law. I sent the footage to the county office and copied it to the local news tip line. I filed a formal cease and desist notice backed by the previous survey. I even had the land assessed again just in case they tried to shift coordinates or play legal hopscotch. Every step was documented, every file backed up in triplicate. If Karen so much as dropped a streamer onto my property, there'd be a legal wall waiting for her. But that didn't stop her. 2 days before the event, she posted a teaser trailer on her page. It featured dramatic orchestral music, slow-motion footage of her previous zipline rides, and a final line of text that read, "June 10th, the Sky Queen returns." I couldn't believe it. She was branding herself like a Marvel superhero. The comments ranged from adoring praise to outright confusion. One person asked if she had permission to use the land. Her response? A laughing emoji followed by, "Nature belongs to all of us." The night before the event, I patrolled my property like it was a military base. I walked the fence line, checked the oak tree for tampering, and ensured my new motion cameras were running. I set up 2 signs on the property edge, both stating in bold letters, "No trespassing. Private land. Unauthorized structures will be reported." But Karen, true to form, simply used stage lights to angle the zipline over the corner of my land where she thought I wouldn't notice. The thing is, I already had a copy of her blueprint. Kyle had slipped it into my mailbox, labeled Operation Flybride. The morning of the event arrived, and the neighborhood buzzed like it was hosting the county fair. Cars lined the cul-de-sac, folding chairs were set up on sidewalks, and someone even had a cotton candy machine chugging away near the HOA clubhouse. I stayed on my porch with a pair of binoculars and a thermos full of sweet tea, watching the madness unfold. Karen appeared at noon sharp, dressed in what I can only describe as a rhinestone-spangled superhero version of a wedding gown. Her veil sparkled like tinsel, and she wore aviator goggles over her eyes. Darren adjusted her harness like he'd done this 100 times, and then they counted down like it was New Year's Eve. 3, 2, 1. She leapt. But what Karen hadn't accounted for was the county's response time. Just as she zipped past the anchor point on my land, a white utility truck pulled up at the edge of my driveway. 2 county officers stepped out, one holding a clipboard, the other a camera. They watched as she zipped directly across my airspace again, completely ignoring the cease and desist order. The second she hit the splash pad on her end, drenched in confetti and glitter, the officers walked straight toward her with the kind of slow, purposeful march that made everyone else take a step back. Karen, soaking wet and beaming, didn't see them until they were 5 feet away. The one with the clipboard spoke first, asking her to confirm her name. When she did, he handed her a summons for violating property laws, ignoring a cease and desist order, and creating an unpermitted structure crossing county boundary lines. Her smile froze. She looked around for support, but most of the guests were now recording her reaction. One of them even whispered, "Oh no, not again." Darren tried to intervene, waving his hands and claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the second officer pulled out the footage I had submitted and pressed play. Karen's own voice came through, crystal clear, saying, "Don't worry, it's just Vince." You could have heard a pin drop. It was poetic. It was precise. And most importantly, it was irrefutable. They didn't arrest her. But they did serve notice that the zipline would be forcibly removed within 48 hours unless she did it herself. Any further use would result in escalating fines and possible criminal charges. Karen looked like someone had poured vinegar in her champagne. She stood there dripping and speechless, blinking behind her soaked goggles. And me? I just raised my thermos in a silent toast and walked back inside. Because that moment wasn't revenge. It was justice, wearing a high-vis vest and holding a clipboard. And the best part? Karen still had no idea that this was just the beginning of the unraveling. The next 48 hours moved like molasses and lightning at the same time. Karen's backyard turned from a carnival into a construction zone overnight. Gone were the twinkle lights and confetti launchers, replaced by extension ladders, tangled zipline cables, and 3 extremely unhappy contractors arguing over how to unbolt steel wire from a tree that wasn't even on Karen's property. The county had made it crystal clear: remove the structure or face daily fines that would rack up faster than HOA meeting minutes. But the real sting wasn't the financial penalty. It was the way people looked at her now. Neighbors, former fans, even the HOA board she once bossed around like a discount dictator. The stares were no longer filled with awe or envy. They were either tired or amused. Karen was no longer Sky Queen. She was the woman who got served mid-Zipline. I kept my distance but kept watch. I didn't interfere, didn't throw smug remarks across the fence, didn't gloat. I didn't have to. Every time she looked in my direction, she saw a man sitting calmly on his porch, sipping tea, with a clear boundary line and a very green lawn. I made sure of that. The irony was rich. She had launched an entire war for attention, only to be completely ignored in the end. But something told me she wasn't done. Karen didn't go down quietly. If her ego took a hit, she'd scramble to find a new way to win, even if it meant rewriting the rules completely. And sure enough, it didn't take long before her next move landed right on my doorstep, literally. 2 days after the Zipline takedown, a formal-looking envelope appeared tucked under my doormat. No postage, no courier, just an envelope with my name written in gold marker and sealed with a sticker of a crown. Inside was an invitation. Karen was hosting a community reconciliation picnic at the HOA Greenbelt. There'd be food, drinks, games, music, and a public airing of grievances and healing. The note finished with a line that read, "Let's be neighbors again, but better." It was such an obviously staged PR move that I nearly laughed out loud. But the final sentence gave me pause. Dress appropriately for public acknowledgement. Public acknowledgement. That wasn't about healing. That was about optics. Karen wanted a photo op. She was staging a comeback, pretending to be the gracious, forgiving queen after being humiliated by her own arrogance. The picnic wasn't a peace offering. It was a trap, a narrative shift. She wanted me there so she could frame herself as the magnanimous leader who could forgive even the cranky old farmer who sabotaged her wedding. If I didn't show, she'd spin it. If I did show, she'd use it. It was classic Karen. No accountability, just performance. So I decided to attend. But I wasn't going unprepared. I spoke to Linda, Jorge, and a few others who'd grown just as tired of Karen's antics. We met the evening before the event in Jorge's garage, where he kept everything from a smoker to a functioning ham radio tower. I laid it out clearly. This wasn't about confrontation. This was about truth. If Karen wanted a public show, then we would show up. But instead of acting like background extras in her little redemption film, we'd bring our own truth. Pictures, documents, videos, testimonials. We'd set the record straight in the most polite, community-appropriate way possible. Not by shouting or disrupting, but by simply being there with facts in hand. No drama. Just presence. The day of the picnic, the weather was perfect. Too perfect, like it was mocking the absurdity of the whole event. The HOA Greenbelt had been decked out like a wedding reception. Pastel tablecloths, balloon arches, fake ivy on folding chairs. A local food truck sat near the entrance offering Sky Queen smoothies and overpriced sliders. Karen stood near the center of it all, wearing a flowing white sundress and a headset microphone. She gave hugs that didn't reach her eyes and waved like she was hosting a game show. Darren stood beside her, noticeably quieter these days, his sunglasses swapped out for regular ones, probably hoping no one remembered his failed midnight engineering stint. I walked in with a few folders under my arm and a calm expression. A few people nodded at me, some gave small smiles. Karen spotted me and beamed like she'd just won a prize. She practically glided across the grass, arms wide, announcing, "Vince, you came. See, everyone? Community works." I nodded politely and said, "I'm here for the food." She laughed, too loudly, then leaned in and whispered, "Let's keep it civil, okay?" This isn't about the past. I nodded again and walked past her. The games were forgettable. The music was tolerable. The food truck ran out of vegetarian options within 30 minutes. But the real event happened an hour in, when Karen clinked her sparkling cider glass and called for everyone's attention. With Darren holding up a Bluetooth speaker like some kind of wedding DJ, she launched into a speech. It was syrupy, full of passive-aggressive language cloaked in faux positivity. She talked about the importance of letting go, of moving forward, of not holding grudges when we're all just trying our best. She never named names, but everyone knew who she meant when she said things like, "Some of us have felt targeted for simply being creative or passionate about our community. And others, well, others may have misunderstood those passions." Then she gestured toward me. "Vince, would you like to say a few words?" I could feel every eye turn to me. Karen was expecting either silence or an angry rant she could use against me later. What she didn't expect was calm, composed clarity. I stepped forward, opened the folder, and began reading. I listed dates and facts: Zipline installations, property damage, HOA violations, and citations served. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I just read aloud the truth, one entry at a time, with photographic evidence stapled behind every page. As I spoke, the mood shifted. People weren't just hearing the facts, they were remembering their own experiences. The time Karen rewrote meeting minutes to favor her vote. The sudden fines that disappeared after enough complaint. The strange HOA expense listed as public art, which turned out to be her self-portrait made from glitter. I finished my list, thanked everyone for listening, and returned to my seat. Karen stood frozen, holding her cider like a microphone that had betrayed her. The rest of the picnic played out like a party whose host had forgotten what the celebration was for. Conversations drifted away from her. Neighbors began talking to each other in new ways. Small groups formed, people comparing notes, trading stories. Jorge pulled out a folder of his own. Linda passed around copies of the audit request. Karen smiled through clenched teeth, but the cracks were obvious now. Her kingdom was crumbling. Not because of some big public takedown, but because people were simply tired of pretending she was in charge. I left before sunset, the smell of grilled corn and glitter air freshener lingering behind me. As I walked back to my property, I passed the spot where the zipline used to cross the fence. The grass had grown back already, soft and green and silent. No more screams in the air. No more shadows over my tomatoes. Just land restored. But I knew Karen. I knew this wouldn't be the final chapter. She wasn't the type to surrender without one last act. The question wasn't if she'd retaliate, it was how. And while she plotted whatever came next, I would be ready. Because the only thing more dangerous than a zipline Karen was a Karen who felt cornered. And judging by the way she avoided eye contact at the end of the picnic, her back was already against the fence. 2 weeks passed with nothing but birdsong and breeze over the fields, a silence so pristine it almost felt suspicious. No zipline sounds, no HOA letters, no passive-aggressive flyers tucked under my truck wipers. Just peace. That alone should have been a warning sign. When Karen was quiet, she wasn't defeated, she was scheming. I had seen it too many times before, the pattern of fury followed by silence, followed by something absurd. So when the peace dragged on longer than a week, I started preparing without knowing what exactly I was preparing for. I double-checked my cameras. I replaced the batteries in the motion sensors. I even walked the perimeter with my dog, Scout, just to make sure nothing had been tampered with. I told myself it was probably nothing, but I didn't believe that for a second. Then came the mail. Not a letter. A package. No return address. Inside was a framed photo of Karen in mid-zipline, arms outstretched like she was flying through a perfume commercial. At the bottom, in cursive gold, were the words, *thanks for the airtime. K. I stared at it for a moment, then laughed so hard I nearly dropped it. Petty? Absolutely. But that wasn't the real twist. The next day, 3 more people in the neighborhood got the exact same framed photo: Jorge, Linda, and even the retired librarian on the corner who hadn't spoken to Karen in 6 years. It was her strange way of reasserting dominance, like a cat dragging in a dead bird and waiting to be praised. But this time, no one took the bait. The community had changed. People who once nodded politely in HOA meetings now spoke freely about their grievances. Neighbors were organizing informal meetups, skipping official gatherings in favor of backyard barbecues and garden tours. Karen's iron grip on the board was loosening. Darren resigned quietly, citing personal matters, after his face showed up in too many drone videos trying to reattach Zipline anchors in the dark. Linda pushed for a full vote to restructure the HOA leadership and, to everyone's surprise, it passed unanimously. Karen still held a position, but she was no longer queen of anything. More like a dethroned monarch waving from a folding chair while the village moved on without her. Still, I wasn't convinced she was out of moves. I figured if she couldn't win through control, she'd try through chaos. And sure enough, it wasn't long before a fresh commotion rose from her yard, this time involving ropes, poles, and what looked like a rotating swing set. I peered through the binoculars and squinted. It wasn't a zipline. Not quite. It was some sort of rotating aerial silk setup. Basically, instead of gliding from one point to another, you dangled from fabric strips and spun in the air like a performance artist. She was rebranding, reinventing, and worst of all, she'd erected the central rig exactly 1 inch from the boundary line between her yard and mine. It was legal. Barely. But it wasn't about legality, it was about spectacle. She began inviting people over again, mostly out-of-towners, influencers who didn't know the history. They filmed reels, posted clips, spun in glittery dresses while soft music played in the background. Karen wore a headset microphone again and called it HOA Harmony Aerial Yoga. Her latest video said, "We're back and better than ever. No wires needed, just dreams and fabric." I could practically hear her gloating from across the yard. But dreams and fabric couldn't hide the wear and tear on the community's patience. The HOA board began receiving noise complaints again. One neighbor's dog had a panic attack when Karen fired off a confetti cannon without warning. Another complained that the music was interfering with her husband's hearing aid. The final straw was when one of the silk ropes snapped mid-spin, sending a young woman into Karen's koi pond. The video caught it in full. Splash, scream, fish flailing everywhere. It went viral. Again. This time, the fallout was worse. Not just because someone got hurt, though luckily she only suffered a bruised ego and a ruined phone, but because it proved Karen hadn't learned a thing. She had pivoted from one reckless performance to another, never asking for permission, never acknowledging the rules she trampled. The board met in emergency session. Karen argued that the incident had occurred within her legal property and was therefore outside the board's authority. But this time, nobody nodded along. Even her former allies had begun to distance themselves. She had exhausted the benefit of the doubt. By now, I had no intention of retaliating. Karen had already done the work for me. Her legacy was collapsing under the weight of her own ego. But I did have one final thing to do, a symbolic end to the saga. I decided to build a fence. Not a spite fence. A real one. 10 feet tall, all natural cedar, with thorny bushes planted alongside to deter any idea of future fabric-based acrobatic. I filed the permits properly, got it approved by the county, and even invited the new HOA chair to come inspect it herself. She smiled and said, "Honestly, it's long overdue." The day we broke ground, half the neighborhood stopped by to help. Linda brought lemonade. Jorge brought his toolbox. Even the shy high school kid from 3 doors down brought his Bluetooth speaker and played music while we worked. We weren't just putting up a fence. We were drawing a line, one that meant something. Not just about property, but about dignity, boundaries, and the right to live without being dragged into someone else's delusional circus. It took us 3 days to finish, and when we were done, I hung a small wooden sign in the center. No flights beyond this point. Karen didn't speak to me for a week after that. When we finally crossed paths, it was at the community mailbox. She looked tired, worn down, like someone who had spent too long fighting battles she invented herself. She muttered a half-hearted "morning," and I nodded in return. There was nothing else to say. We weren't friends. We weren't enemies anymore either. We were just neighbors, separated by a fence and a long story full of lessons. Life returned to normal. The birds came back. The zipline was gone. The aerial rig disappeared after the HOA implemented a new structure proximity policy. And as for Karen, she turned her energy toward less intrusive projects. Word had it she was working on a podcast about neighborhood drama. I didn't subscribe. My tomatoes grew better that season. The quiet helped. So did the sunlight no longer being blocked by glitter banners. I even started a small roadside stand to sell produce. Eggs, peppers, strawberries in summer. People stopped by. They asked about the sign. Some already knew the story. Others heard it for the first time and laughed so hard they bought extra eggs just to say thanks for the entertainment. I never told them the whole thing. Some stories are best experienced in fragments. But sometimes, late in the evening, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear the faintest echo of a zipline zip, like the ghost of a glitter-covered queen still clinging to her imaginary throne. And every time I hear it, I tip my hat, smile, and whisper back, "Long live the line."